This is we're gonna. This is the last chapter. I looked at the this lecture comes out of the third edition. Actually, it comes from probably the second edition. They just added the 15th chapter not very long ago. Well, in the fourth edition, as far as I can remember. I looked at it and I thought it was so Western. It didn't seem to fit any other any other culture. Um, this chapter is about mental health in around the world in other cultures. As Dene people, you probably recognize the fact that you have cultural mental health situations that don't have a similarity to anything in Western mental health in the Western cultures. Specifically, you believe in skinwalkers. You have taboos against even talking about death, whereas, of course, that's not something that Western man recognizes. That isn't to say that it doesn't exist. If you believe it exists, it exists. But there are other cultural mental health situations around the world that we're going to talk about today. Um, so this is potentially something that you might want to think about. This is one of the reasons why, if you are counseling someone, that you need to look into their culture. You need to find out about these differences so that you can either steer away from them or maybe talk about them because possibly that is your client's problem. So, it's good to know. I mean, if you were the Apache people believe that most bad things that happen to them are caused by curses from witches. So this is something that you need to think about, and this is one of the reasons why the Apache people have such a high suicide rate is because people feel that there is no way out of being cursed. They've already been cursed, and there's nothing they can do about it. So and so if you're dealing with somebody who's Hopi or somebody who is uh, Comanche, you need to understand their culture because they may have ideas that you don't recognize. Um, of course, that can be ethnocentrism. Of course, believing that your culture is the only right way of doing things, and excluding everyone else is known as ethnocentrism. And just because they're from another tribe doesn't mean that they are wrong and you are right. Just like if you're from the Western world, you can't just assume that because you're from the West that everything that you think is right and everything that everybody else thinks is wrong. You've got to accept people for what they believe and who they are. This lecture comes from I think actually comes from the second edition instead of the third edition. Maybe it does come from the third edition. Chapter 15, I'm not going to do chapter 15. There's a chapter 15 in the fourth edition. I don't think there's one in the third edition. I don't remember there being one. I don't have that textbook. I gave it away to somebody. But I'm not going to deal with the last chapter. It seems so Western. It's called Leadership and Organization. And that just seems so Western to me. I'm not really going to deal with it. Let's make this in the last chapter. You will have there is a final. There's one more test actually. It's the third test that covers chapters 9 through 14. It's a little bit longer. It's 100 questions instead of 75, but it will cover the whole last part of the text. No chapter 15. Sorry. If you were wondering about organization and leadership, then I apologize. You'll have to read it on your own. What counts as a disorder? Psychological disorders are defined as rare behaviors that somehow impair the individual. The problem, what type of impairment is problematic, and what if a behavior that is rare in one context is not rare in another? Indeed, some psychopathologies are more prevalent or manifest in highly different forms across cultures. Of course, depression and anxiety are two problems that we see in the Western world. It seems to be fairly universal. We already know that schizophrenia is seen in every culture around the world. So schizophrenia is another universal problem. But there are some problems that only select cultures recognize. Experiencing a culture-bound syndrome generally requires one to have cultural beliefs associated with the syndrome. In other words, you guys believe in you have the death taboo, but I've been dealing with death all my adult life. So um, potentially, I mean, if I were Danae, then I would be cursed thousands of times over. Because one of my jobs was working in the morgue, and that's kind of hard to do if you can't touch people, if you can't touch cadavers. So that's just the way things are and the way things have worked out. So now we're going to talk about some of the syndromes around the culture-bound syndromes around the world. DOT is a morbid anxiety seen most frequently among South Asian males, that they are losing or leaking semen, and it is believed that the loss of sperm results in the person getting seriously ill. The idea is the more sperm you have, the more semen that you retain, the more virile you will be, the healthier you will be. This often results from anxieties about disapproved sexual acts such as masturbation. Um, and so DOT is a problem in South Asia. Um, that includes Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and India, of course, and Pakistan. That is South Asia. This dot would be a meaningless label in the United States. However, where there are no cultural beliefs about the vitality that sperm endows and no cultural beliefs about the consequences of loss of sperm, is it possible that other cultures suffer from some psychological disorders as the West, but don't have the same cultural beliefs associated with Western diagnoses, making them meaningless in other cultural contexts? And this is kind of a problem because if you are a counselor and you are dealing with somebody from South Asia, then potentially this is a problem, especially if they have been masturbating, I guess, and they're male and they've been masturbating. Then this is a really serious problem as far as they're concerned. If you think you're going to get sick, probably you will get sick. Hikikomori is a condition in Japan characterized by living in an asocial state with no intimate relationships with anyone outside of the immediate family. One of the things we need to remember about the Japanese is that the Japanese are not only a collectivist country, but it's a very crowded country. So living beyond the Japanese culture just isn't done in Japan. Everybody is interconnected, as weird as that may seem. It first appears in junior high, and they end up reading books, watching TV, or playing games in their rooms. This sounds like practically every teenager in the United States. Alone in their room, watching TV, reading books, and playing games. Indications are that the cause may be failure to succeed in a social world that has few options for those who don't fit in. It does not conform to criteria for any of the DSM-5 diagnoses. It has only recently become a cultural phenomenon and is now seen, although rarely, in other East Asian countries. Because of all those countries in East Asia, or the countries in East Asia are very collectivistic. Everybody's so tied together. Somebody who separates themselves and becomes a recluse is seen as different. In the United States, of course, if somebody stayed in their room, read books, watched TV, or played games, they would be considered normal. You probably have brothers, sisters, or children who don't spend a whole lot of time with anybody. They stay in their room. My grandson is starting to play video games and or watch videos on YouTube, and he can spend hours alone, not talking to anybody. And if you try to disturb him, of course, he doesn't hear you. So I think he may have hikikomori. Approximately one child per classroom in junior high and high school is afflicted with hikikomori, largely not existent in pre-war Japan and uncommon in other cultures. That is hikikomori. As you can see, she's a bit of a. And the other problem that they have in Japan is it's so crowded that personal space is limited. And as you can see, this child is suffering from hikikomori. I typed in hikikomori in the internet and looked for pictures, and this is one of the pictures that came out. As you can see, she has stuffed animals on her bed. She just is buried in stuff. Bulimia nervosa, bulimia, uncontrollable binge eating. Individual then takes inappropriate measures to prevent weight gain. They eat and then they get rid of it in one way or another. Usually it's vomiting, sometimes it's taking laxatives, sometimes it's excessive exercise. Absent in most cultures of the world, making it a cultural bound syndrome, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. Of course, if you go to South America, we went to Peru in 2003, and I was surprised that there was nobody that was overweight, but there weren't any people that were starving. Peru is a fairly not well-to-do is not the right word for South America. It's pretty opulent, but nobody was overweight. Came back to the United States, and of course, the first thing we saw at LAX was grotesquely obese people. It was a little shocking. Anyway, bulimia nervosa exists in the United States. It exists in the Western world, but not so much in places where food is not abundant. Eating disorders affect many people in the West, but there are some nuances when it comes to determining universality of these conditions. Bulimia appears to be a culture-bound syndrome because rates have increased over time and the age of people being diagnosed with bulimia has gotten lower over the years. It is also more prevalent in some societies, particularly those with Western influences than others. In particular, it is absent in most cultures of the world, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. There is a good evidence that bulimia is a culture-bound syndrome. Anorexia nervosa is another one. Anorexia, an individual's refusal to maintain normal body weight due to preoccupation with their body. Evidence of culture-bound status. Huge increase in the rates of anorexia this century, primarily found in only some cultures. Evidence of universality. Reports of self-starvation in numerous cultural contexts, but not due to body image. The Instagram seems to have a real serious problem with anorexia and bulimia. It seems to be aiming young girls into trying to lose excessive amounts of weight and complimenting them when they are become stick people. As with bulimia, rates of anorexia have significantly increased over time, and it is absent in many cultures. However, it has been found in cultures that have very little Western influence, and it also manifests differently in some other contexts as well. Symptoms resembling anorexia have also been noted amongst ascetics who refuse food for religious reasons, and in the 17th and 18th century among teenage girls who starve themselves to model themselves after the ascetics. The ascetics are people that are so holy that they don't eat, and that all they do is pray. You see these individuals you can see them in India as yogi, but in the 17th and 18th century, that's the 1600s and 1700s, we saw this among monks and some nuns. They became ascetics, and in essence, they starved themselves to death, thinking that showed glory to God in some interesting way. You can look it up. It's really kind of interesting if you to find out how these people thought. Anyway, and who can argue with the need to please your God? So yeah, that's something that happened. This historical record of anorexia, as well as evidence, if anorexia in many non-Western contexts, have led some to argue that it is a universal disorder, although it may serve different functions in different places. For example, religious reasons versus weight loss reasons. This is Gandhi, not Indira, that's his daughter. Mahatma Gandhi. This is Mahatma Gandhi. He did some really strange things. Not as far as he was concerned. He was trying to get the world. He believed in peace, and he was trying to get the British out of India and Pakistan. So one of the things that he did, he'd go on hunger strikes, and he starved himself almost to the point of death. The other interesting thing he did, he would sleep with young girls. He would sleep with young girls and not have sex with them, or not be tempted to have sex, and that showed, as far as he was concerned, that showed his strength of will. And of course, this is a picture of him with his daughter. That's Indira. She eventually became the prime minister of India, and back in the 70s or 80s, she was assassinated because she was a female running a male-dominated country, and a lot of people didn't like that. Anyway, not important. We're talking about anorexia. So he used his anorexia to control, to get people to listen to him, and it worked. He was very successful. Portero is a morbid anxiety about one's penis shrinking into one's body. It's primarily found in South and East Asia. It is unclear what aspects of culture have led to the emergence of Koro. Koro-like symptoms have been found in some individuals in West African cultures, as well as in individuals in American culture who have had negative marijuana-induced experiences. And it's the idea that your penis is being reabsorbed by your body. Amok is an acute outburst of unrestrained, violent, and homicidal attacks preceded by brooding, followed by exhaustion and amnesia. It's most common in Southeast Asia. This may result from having no acceptable means to express your frustration, so they just run amok. And it's a real thing. It's not just a word, and it's not just an idea. These people actually exist, or people just go on these homicidal rampages, and afterwards they collapse. There was a similar situation. The Vikings used to say that a warrior would go berserk, and going berserk meant that he was running amok. In other words, you couldn't stop him, and he would just butcher everybody he came across, and this was known as going berserk. Now, normally, of course, they tried to negotiate, they tried to get all the money, they tried to get what they wanted just by defeating the enemy. But when somebody went berserk, they would just kill every non-Viking in the area. They would butcher them, and this. You can look it up. It's really kind of an interesting idea. Berserk is the other word. Hysteria is a commonly diagnosed condition in the 19th century Europe among women. Symptoms include temporary blindness, insomnia, fainting, and loss of appetite for food and sex. Rates of hysteria diagnosis dropped dramatically in the early 20th century. Some think this is due to its being replaced by other diagnostic categories, while others think that it was associated with repressive Victorian cultural norms. And there were some repressive norms. Women weren't allowed to inherit. Women had to stay chaste. In other words, they weren't allowed to express their sexuality. Women weren't allowed to enjoy sexual contact. So if they did enjoy, or if they did happen to react to sexual contact, one of the things that might happen is they might become hysterical, thinking that they had done something horribly wrong. So hysteria was fairly common in the 19th century. And of course, one of the problems with reading theories coming out of the 19th century is that they had to deal with hysteria. So if you read Freud, who wrote in the late 19th century, who did most of his theorizing in the late 19th century, he deals with hysteria a great deal. Almost all of his theories are based on what he was seeing in 19th century Vienna. So hysteria is very real, and it has to do with sexual repression. Something that we have seen in the 20th century, in the 50s and 60s. There was a sexual explosion of sorts in the 50s and 60s. In the 50s and 60s, and it had to do with the fact that people were so repressed before. Now, the reality is, if you look at the United States and you look at the sexual repression, it went away in the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. And then we had the Depression, and then we had World War II. And after World War II, there were a lot of, that's when the baby boom happened. So people had different ideas. And during the Depression, we went back to Victorian ideals, as weird as that may seem. But in the 50s, of course, this all broke out because women needed to express themselves, and they weren't going to, since they were allowed, they needed their labor during World War II. They didn't allow themselves to be put back into that Victorian mindset, and that's when all of this stuff kind of went away. But hysteria was very real. It has to do with sexual repression. Phrygia Phobia is a morbid fear of catching cold. This is really kind of weird. It's found largely in China. People avoid cold air, eating cold food, they dress with several layers just to make sure they stay warm. This disorder has been linked to other psychological disorders such as hypochondriasis and obsessive compulsive disorder. So Phrygia Phobia is something that you see in China. So in the summertime, when it's in the 80s and 90s, they'll be walking around in a winter coat with a hat on their head. Phrygia Phobia may be culturally linked to Koro, where that disorder causes male sufferers to feel that their penis is retracting into the body due to an insufficiency of male element. And of course, the male element in a culture that believes in yin and yang is the yang element. The yin element is the female element. Male Phrygia sufferers correlate coldness with an overabundance of the female element, or yin. And that's not really a picture. That is that's just an icicle that looks like a human, as weird as that is. So it looks like somebody's looking in the window, but it's not. And of course, just because you live in China doesn't mean you're going to freeze to death if you don't put on really lots of layers and lots of warm clothes. Susto is a frightening condition in which a person thinks their soul has been caused to become dislodged from their body, causing a variety of physical and psychological symptoms. Primarily, it is found in Latin America. Susto. Yeah, okay. Voodoo Death, person is convinced a curse has been placed on him or her, or she has broken a taboo, resulting in severe fear reaction, which may lead to death. It's mostly found in Africa. It's also found in the Caribbean and around the New Orleans area in Louisiana. This is if you believe it, it could potentially happen. Voodoo death. Lata is a transient dissociated state brought on by a startling event, followed by engaging in cultural inappropriate behavior, after which the person has no memory of the episode. It's found primarily in Southeast Asia, but also in Siberia and amongst the Ainu in Japan. So if they get afraid, they black out, and then they will come out of it, and they don't remember what happened. It's a good way to forget a traumatic event, I guess. Lata. Malgory is a concern that one has been invaded by a totemic spirit that makes them sick, tired, and drowsy because they entered the sea or a new territory without having engaged in the appropriate ceremonial rituals. This is identified among some Aboriginal Australians. You need to be really careful. Of course, the Aborigines, when they controlled all of Australia, it was segmented into different groups, and they would put curses on their territory so that if somebody else came in, they couldn't. They would get sick, and that's what Malgory has to do with going into somebody else's territory. Orgonius is an anxiety disorder that includes a burning sensation, loss of breath, and sleeping, among other symptoms. Primarily, it's found in Portugal and the Azores. Of course, the Azores are the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa that belong to Portugal. So this has to do with a Portuguese idea. Kungfu Isisa is anxiety and somatic problems associated with mental exhaustion stemming from too much thinking. Primarily, it's found in Africa, the Caribbean, and among select Native Americans and East Asian. The idea that you can think too much and it will hurt you. Attacks de nerfs is a feeling, palpitations, numbness, and a rising heat sensation during emotionally charged situations such as funerals. It has been found in Puerto Rico. Of course, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but it's attack of nerves is what it's called. Universal syndromes highlight the biological bases of these psychopathologies. Still, prevalence and manifestations of these disorders may differ across cultures. The DSM-5 major depressive disorder diagnosed given 5 of the following 9 symptoms: depressed mood, inability to feel pleasure. These are some of the universal syndromes. Depressed mood, inability to feel pleasure, change in weight or appetite, sleep problems, psychomotor change, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless or guilty, poor concentration, or suicidality. These are any 5 of these 9 symptoms, then you will be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder has been found in all cultures that people have studied. Prevalence rates appears to vary. Depression prevalence rates vary in the United States based on diagnostic criteria. The rate in China is about 1/5 that observed in the West. Does that mean that they're not as depressed, or does that mean they're not allowed to show depression because it is a more collectivist society? That's one way of, that's something that you need to look at. One proposed rationale for this is due to 2 different manifestations of the symptoms. Somatization, symptoms are primarily physiological, such as loss of appetite. Psychologization, symptoms are primarily psychological, such as depressed mood. So there has to be a physiological aspect to it. That's the way they diagnose it in China. Then it wouldn't be diagnosed nearly as much. In the United States, of course, in the Western world, we're just looking for psychological symptoms, depressed mood. Then we may diagnose it as depression, as major depressive disorder. Many Chinese psychiatric patients are diagnosed with neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is poor appetite, headaches, insomnia, inability to concentrate. It's low-level depression is what it is. That's what we used to call it in the West. Now we've taken it out of the DSM-5. It's no longer in there, but it is in it is a diagnostic tool that they use in China. Neurasthenia was dropped from the DSM because symptoms were not physiological, were more physiological than psychological. Some have argued that most Chinese neurasthenia actually qualifies for depression, even if only 9% of them report feeling depressed. Social anxiety disorder is a fear of acting in an inept and unacceptable manner, leading to negative social consequences. Research has shown that East Asians exhibit more social anxiety symptoms than European Americans. Accordingly, evidence suggests that interdependence is associated with heightened social anxiety. However, social anxiety is less documented in East Asian countries, as weird as that may seem. It has been documented universally, but counterintuitively, it is less documented in East Asian countries than in North American countries, despite greater concerns about social harmony and maintaining faith in East Asia. Certainly, East Asians exhibit greater social anxiety symptoms, and there is some link between interdependence and social anxiety symptoms. In general, though, the rates of social anxiety disorder in North America and Europe are 14 times higher than rates in East Asia. The paradox between East Asians experiencing more symptoms but not meeting clinical criteria for social anxiety disorder may be due to the differences in what behaviors are considered culturally normative. In Western cultures, the norm is for people to be extroverted. In East Asian cultures, the norm is for people to be introverted. So social anxiety is a natural state for people in East Asia, and because we are more extroverted, it is not a natural state, mental state for people in Western cultures. That's not to say that social anxieties do not become a problem in East Asian cultures. There is a culture-bound disorder called Taijin Fushu, or a fear of confronting others. It is a fear that is elicited by social situations such that one is concerned about how uncomfortable one makes other people feel, perhaps because of their gaze, their body odor, or sweating. It is similar to social anxiety disorder because it is effectively treated using the same antidepressant as is used to treat social anxiety disorder. It has thus far been limited to Japan, China, and South Korea. Taijin Fushu. Suicide rates vary dramatically around the world. Eastern Europe tends to have the highest rates. Muslim nations tend to have the lowest. Suicide rates also vary depending on one's age, with the elderly generally being more likely to commit suicide in most cultures. There's a special case in Micronesia in which there is a spike in the adolescent age group. This started primarily in the 1970s when a spate of suicides occurred among adolescent men over seemingly trivial problems with no obvious psychological issues to begin with. These suicides were also restricted to specific islands, particularly the suburban regions of those islands. Some have suggested that this spike was due to westernization of the island, leading to a loss of traditional roles for young men. And of course, you guys can identify with losing your culture and therefore feeling lost. And there we go. Micronesia, as you can see, there's this huge spike between the ages of 15 and 24. USA is here. Here's Egypt. None. Okay, that's Egypt. This is Hungary in Eastern Europe. And there's Japan. Japan's about the same as it is in the United States. No, it's higher. Why is Japan higher? Good question. Japan may be higher because Japan has a very competitive educational system. where you have to take a test. Children, teenagers are studying constantly because if they don't pass this test, they won't get into high school. So it is very competitive and very anxiety producing. And if they fail, then a lot of times they will commit suicide, or sometimes they will commit suicide. There's a certain forest in Japan, right outside of Tokyo, that's called the suicide forest, where people go to kill themselves. Losing connection between one's cultural narrative and modern society, lack of cultural continuity, seems to put people at risk for suicide. Many First Nations bands do not have a strong sense of cultural continuity due to Western colonization. Many youths cannot identify with their traditional culture and are also unable to identify with mainstream Canadian culture. Support for this argument has come from findings that bands with stable connections to traditional cultural pasts have lower suicide rates. Such a connection is indicated by negotiating a land claim with the government, possessing self-government, maintaining control over educational services, controlling their police and fire services, managing health services, and cultural facilities. The more these indicators are present, the lower the suicide rate. And this is actually what I did my research on, not in Canada, but on the Canadian border with a Northern Plains tribe, two Northern Plains tribes, three, I guess. Anyway, we were dealing with what creates resilience for those individuals. Was it education? Was it age? Was it gender? Did it have to do with trauma? Or did it have to do with culture? And the one significant factor that we found was the stronger the culture, the stronger the resilience that these people the subjects showed. The other thing that was interesting was that trauma had nothing to do with resilience. It didn't lower resilience. The more trauma you were in, it didn't lower resilience. Kind of interesting. So my own research for my dissertation agrees with Heine and some of the results that they've seen. One of the things that you need to recognize and to deal with is the fact that Canada talks a better ball game than they actually play. In other words, Canada claims to support their First Nation people, but the reality is, and some of these things are coming out now since they found these hidden graves around boarding schools, that they really did a poor job of dealing with Indigenous peoples in Canada. Another factor that you need to realize is that when you look at trafficked women in Canada, 50% of them are Indigenous women. And you can interpret this any way you like. It seems to me that one of the problems in Canada is they have a low opinion of Indigenous people, and they use them, and they have used them in the past. As prostitutes. It's really kind of a tragedy. We don't see it's not to that extent in the United States, thank goodness, but in Canada it's pretty abysmal, and the Canadians, of course, won't admit it, and that's part of the problem. One fundamental hypothesis that researchers have found support for this is the lack of connection to one's cultural roots is a strong predictor of suicide rates. This is compounded by the fact that many do not identify with the mainstream Canadian culture. Indeed, research has found that the more that First Nations communities connect with their cultural history, the lower their suicide rates are. The communities that have the most number of connections have suicide rates that are comparable with those of mainstream Canada. These connections include having its own policing and law enforcement organization, cultural facilities that promote a community's cultural history, having one's own political body, and whether or not a community is negotiating a claim for territorial land. And of course, that's huge up in Canada. You got to remember that Canada belonged to England for an extended length of time. And so their way of seeing things was that the queen owned everything, or the king, and when they actually uh, separated from England. The king owned everything, and you had to lay a claim to it. So, in order to own something in Canada, you have to get it from the government, and that's the way it is with Indigenous people as well. Despite the universal prevalence of suicides, prevalence rates still differ dramatically across cultures. Motivations for suicide also vary greatly across cultures. Motivations in the West usually include substance abuse or depression. Motivations in Japan often deal with one accepting responsibility or preserving honor. The case of First Nations and Micronesia suggests that different cultures have different motivations for suicide, and it may carry different meaning in different cultures. For instance, Japan has a long history of suicide, playing an unusually significant role with the ritualized suicide method of seppuku. And that's what seppuku seppuku is done with a short knife. It's not done with a samurai sword. Schizophrenia is one of the most debilitating mental disorders and universally found around the world. There are relevant genetic factors, prenatal experiences, and neuroanatomical features. Diagnosed given two or more of the following. So this is in order to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, two of these things have to be part of your mindset: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, negative symptoms, and catatonic behavior. Schizophrenia is a disorder that is diagnosed when one exhibits two or more of these symptoms: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, catatonic or grossly disorganized behavior, and negative symptoms such as flat affect or loss of speech. That's what I just said. There is good evidence of a genetic component of schizophrenia. One's likelihood of developing schizophrenia decreases as the degree of genetic relatedness with someone who has schizophrenia increases. Despite its biological basis and similar incidence rates across cultures, some cultural variations still exists. That is, only 1% of general population will develop schizophrenia. Having a cousin with the disorder leads to a likelihood of 2%. Having a sibling with schizophrenia increases the likelihood to 9%. And having an identical twin increases the likelihood to 48%. As one would expect with something that has a biological basis, incidence and prevalence rates are quite similar across different cultures. But notice that, despite the role of genetics, there is still more than a 50% chance that someone would not develop schizophrenia even if their identical twin, with whom one shares 100% of the genes, has schizophrenia. So there's something else involved other than genes. Something has to trigger it. Subtypes of schizophrenia vary substantially. In the West, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia as high as 75%, rate of catatonic schizophrenia 1 to 3%. In India, a rate of paranoid schizophrenia as high as 15%, and a rate of catatonic schizophrenia at 20%. Also, patients in less developed societies have greater rate of recovery than in more industrialized societies. This is the opposite of what one sees with other physical and mental pathologies. The cause of this difference is unknown. Some suggest that patients are more likely to remain members of a community in such societies rather than becoming homeless in industrialized societies. And that's the way it works in the United States. Interestingly, patients in less developed societies have greater rates of recovery from schizophrenia than more industrialized societies, which is the opposite of what one sees in other physical and mental conditions. Explanations for this counterintuitive pattern include laying less blame on the patient due to his or her having less of a primary sense of control, having more positive associations with what the West considers to be hallucinations, and greater involvement of the community so that the person does not get left alone. Just as presentation and prevalence of psychological disorders vary across cultures, the same goes for how the disorders are treated. There is a tradition in the West of patients seeing a therapist and verbalizing their feelings and problems, likely rooted in the Western emphasis on self expression and being in a low context culture, among many other ideas discussed in this course. There is culture variation in coping and seeking support. East Asians are less likely than European Americans to actively seek social support. This is due to concerns about how this will disrupt relationships with others. Instead, they rely on implicit social support, reminding themselves of the close relationships that they have. This may explain why East Asians tend to seek professional mental health treatment less than Westerners. Western treatment traditions can be traced back to Freudian times. Psychological problems are best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences. As treatment has extended into modern times, there is an emphasis on understanding the individual, his or her self discovery, and his or her cognitive biases. Freud thought that psychological problems were best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences because such problems were believed to be rooted in a person's conflicts at an unconscious level. And the therapist should then interpret these experiences and memories. Carl Rogers then introduced the client-centered approach, and other biological modes of thought have since been developed as well. But the common thread running through all the different therapy options is the client's ability to engage with the therapist. In contrast to Western style, two broad categories of treatments can be seen elsewhere. Family-centered, family seen as a key source of guidance and play an important role in treatment, and spiritualism and religion, consulting psychological disorders as a problem with one's spirituality or a relationship with gods that went awry. In other cultures, healing practices are performed very differently. One of the most common practices is the role of families. They share the problems with the individual and also share the stigma and blame associated with whatever mental illness the individual has. Another common practice involves spiritualism and religion, which incorporates traditional healers such as shamans and sorcerers. Japan also has a couple of unique approaches to psychotherapy that reflect the cultural inclinations of Japan. The two are called Morita therapy and Nikan therapy. Morita therapy is used to treat depression and anxiety symptoms. It does so by emphasizing secondary control, asking clients to accept the circumstances of their lives. The client must change their perspectives of the symptoms and learn to live productively in spite of those symptoms. To live productive lives, the treatment plan involves light manual activities such as sweeping, heavy manual labor such as chopping wood, and other forms of life training. Nikon therapy is used to treat people with depression and addiction problems. Clients are asked to reflect on their past, particularly on the kindnesses that they have received from others, while thinking about how little they have offered in return for those kindnesses. In other words, they shame them. Given the cultural diversity and prevalence rates of psychopathologies, one concern that has been raised is whether Western mental health treatments may sometimes do more harm than good. For instance, it's been argued that anorexia did not exist in the same form in Hong Kong until it was imported there. Similarly, post-traumatic stress disorder was not a big problem in Sri Lanka after the 2004 tsunami until Western aid workers insisted that they must be suffering from it. In other words, we convinced them to have mental illnesses. And that is the end of the chapter. So you can look at this in a lot of different ways. It's possible that we are creating our own problems by trying to convince people that they have problems. So that's one way to look at it. If somebody doesn't believe in depression, then you shouldn't try to convince them that depression exists, I guess. That's the end of the chapter. I really enjoy teaching this class. Good luck with your paper and good luck with Good luck with the final test. If you have any problems with your paper, if you can't find a book, give me a call. I have office hours every Monday through Thursday. Uh, I'll be glad to help you in any way I possibly can. Like I said, I was in English. My bachelor's degree is in English in literature, so I have a background in reading and in literature. So I can probably find you something to read. Okay, so I'll see you next semester in some other class.